thank you everyone for showing up and also participating in the WebEx today. Our topic is the Lake Clark Soils Inventory Project Report. And Dr. Aaron Wells from ABR Inc. Environmental Research and Services will be presenting to us. He is a project lead for the soils inventory for Lake Clark. And in a minute, I'll turn this over to him. But before we get going, I basically want to give a 10,000-foot level overview of the inventory program in the Alaska Regional Office. Basically, our task is to identify natural resources that the National Park Service manages, and there's a list of 12 natural resources identified that we are to inventory across the nation. And 3 of those inventories, which are the base cartography, the soils, and the land cover, or vegetation inventories, are managed in the Alaska Regional Office in Anchorage. And I am program manager for that group, and basically we're just a small group of 2 people, myself and Beth Colton, our GIS specialist. And what we do is we hire subject matter experts to help us inventory these natural resources. In this case, it's a soils inventory. And we hire subject matter experts, and they perform basically a mapping and identification of resources for us. And they identify what we have, how much we have, where is it located, and what's the current state of those resources. And information, we can then set about managing those resources because now we know what we have. So we'll identify them, and then either through monitoring or other management actions, the parks will go about its business managing natural resources. So that's kind of where we fit into the overall natural resources identification and management within the National Park Service. Third, Alaska Biological, I'm just going to say ER, to conduct a soils inventory for Lake Clark National Park. And we started this project about 2 years ago. And took it on and has been doing a bang-up job, and today he'll be giving us his findings and basically an overview of the report that they've generated and delivered to us. So one thing is we get these inventories completed. We basically receive a deliverable from the cooperator, either like a university or in this case a contractor. And those deliverables include a lengthy report that describes the methods used in conducting the inventory. We also get GIS, such as maps and, in this case, raster-based maps of soils within Lake Clark. And it data that describes the on-the-ground measurements that our cooperator obtained when doing field work. And we attribute that to our end-user community. In most cases, it's for National Park Service employees, but also we distribute this to the general public. So this is the whole wrap-up of that delivery process, and it basically helps us know what we're getting from the contractor. So with that in mind, I'll do one last thing, and that'll be to go around the table here in the Alaska Regional Office and just have everybody say who they are and what group they work with, and then we'll turn it over to Aaron. So my name is Parker Martin, and I'm the Regional Inventory Program Manager for within INM, National Park Service.
Amy Miller, ecologist with the Southwest Alaska Network.
Jeff Shear, Lake Clark. Guy Adama, the regional office.
Biometrician at the Southwest Inventory Monitoring Network. Network. Heather Coletti with the Southwest Alaska Network.
Michael Sherd with the Southwest Alaska Network.
That's Beth Colton, Alaska Regional Office. And who else do we have online?
Part to Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
From Katmai.
Hi, Whitney.
Guys, including Sharon Kim, Christina Creedeman, and Deb Kurtz.
Lindsay with the Inventory and Monitoring Program.
Hi.
With Lake Clark.
You stepped on each other one more time, please.
Brian Houseman in Denali National Park.
Hi, Brian.
And Rebecca Jones and Lake Clark.
Rebecca.
An I&M program.
We have everyone?
Eric 80 at Denali.
Hi, Eric. Everyone. That's a good crowd. I appreciate your attendance. I think we'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, this is Aaron Wells with AR Inc. in Fairbanks. Can everyone hear me? Oh.
Loud and clear here?
Okay. If not hear me, I guess that would be the better question. Sounds good. Okay, I want to just introduce myself. As I said, I've worked at ABR for almost 5 years now. I'm a vegetation ecologist with a strong influence in soils, plant actions, and so I was project by Matt McCander, our remote sensing and GIS specialist here, and Tracy Christopherson, our lead soil scientist at ABR. So they'll be here Matt will be presenting some of the slides, and they'll be here to answer questions as well. So some pretty, in-depth slides here, and so I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of these slides. And so if you have questions, though, just feel free to ask, but I would like to just save questions for the end, if possible. But if there's anything right away, just go ahead. So to begin, this is an overview here. So I'll go through an introduction to the ecological land survey approach, the soil landscapes approach, this study versus the integrated terrain unit approach, the ITU approach. And then we'll talk about the ecotypes, which are kind of the core of both methods. Talk the methodology for the field, and then the mapping, results and discussion, and then I'll go through how to use this LS of the report open, and we can do some examples. To begin, the ecological land survey and soil landscape mapping approach, use pre-existing GIS and remote sensing data, ground data, and GIS modeling techniques to develop raster-based ecotype and soils maps. So applications include, landscape scale analyses of ecological components, landscape scale management and planning, and development of stratified sampling designs for landscape scale inventory and monitoring. We're talking thousands to hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And it's for larger tip Alaska, it's more cost effective. Fewer per acre are required for the mapping, and GIS modeling reduces office time spent hand digitizing. Examples include Wrangell St. Elias, the network parks, and the Lake Clark National Park and Preserve ELS and soil landscape mapping reports. As you can see here, the cover of all three of those that ABR has prepared. Here's an example just of the map, and I'll get into more detail about these later. The terrain unit approach, it's a type of integrated data management. It's polygon-based mapping, and it's a process of adjusting mapped boundaries delineated by hand on high-resolution satellite or aerial imagery. And the idea is that there's increased coincidence between boundaries of the interdependent variables, so geology, landform, physiography, soils, and vegetation. The include fine-scale, site-specific management planning, monitoring, study design. Tends to be expensive per acre. There's more plots required, and the polygons are hand digitized. A little more time-consuming. And there's examples for Lake Clark and Katmai for coastal monitoring, and Ray and Elias, Sonata Lake Trail EIS. Now I'll just show some quick maps here. Here's the Wrangles, Sonata Lake Trail study area, and so for you have physiography. Each polygon is attributed with physiography, vegetation, general texture, and then you get an ecotype map and a landscape sensitivity map in this case. So I only put up to contrast the methods so that you can think about the applications of the landscape soil mapping and the scale at which it would be applicable. And we'll talk more about that later. And both approaches are ecotypes. And these are local scale ecosystems. They combine similar vegetation, soils, and environment into a comprehensive ecosystem classification. So if you see up here in the figure A here, ecotypes, you have all these different components of the ecoregion. Kind of is the largest scale. Organisms, climate, parent material, topography, hydrology, and soil type. And in there, where those combine, you have ecotypes, where you have distinctive combinations of these factors. And then down here shows the scale of these different, on the time scale here on the left, and then the spatial scale is how these all interact. So Lake Clark. So here's Alpine, Subalpine, and Glacial ecotypes. Like rocky lake and tundra. For the Subalpine, interior Subalpine, ashy, loamy, alder, willow shrub, and then in recently deglaciated areas, glacial, sandy, rocky alder shrub. Moving, down through the Upland, Lowland, and Riverine ecosystems. So we basically partitioned the landscape based on physiography, and then within those domains, then we classify the ecotypes within there. Coastal ecotype areas that are affected by salt water. So methods for Lake Clark. In 2011, we had 3 crews out from August 8th through 17th and the 12th to 18th of September. We completed 267 plots along 44 transects. Crew equals 1 botanist and 1 soil scientist. Just generally, the data elements that we collect are vegetation data, so composition and structure, soil stratigraphy, including soil lab samples, and general environment data, so geomorphology and hydrology are goals. We follow gradient-oriented sampling design, so meaning we use topo sequences, which are technically our transects, that first from, say, a ridge down into a valley, and we can capture the various environments along that topo sequence. And we look at these in representative environments. In this case, we talked with Paige Spencer and Amy Miller, and they sent us some locations that they thought were representative of the unique environments of Lake Clark. So a slide of our study sites. So I'll talk a little more about the other data that we use. The blue points within the park are the points that we collected in 2011. The other points are supplemental data that we gathered from other studies. Like I said, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Just an example, a conceptual model of one of our transects from Red Glacier to Lenore Hill. And I could spend 20 minutes on this slide talking about, where we sold, but it gives you a sense of, we would start up high, and we would work over this ridge. This was a helicopter transect. This was a, 100-meter cliff. So we worked our way down to the glacier itself and to Red Glacier, and along the way. And so you get the geomorphology up here. Down here is the microtopography and the vegetation, which is Viric level 4, and the soils, and you get a set of patterns across the landscape, which understand the landscape for mapping. Another example is for the Henmore Lake lowlands. We encountered permafrost here. This is an glacial fluvial deposits, bogs, and glacial lacustrine deposits. And so you get a sense for, this is from our field data, some of it's conceptual, like the depth of permafrost, we don't really know because we only dug, to a meter here. But you get the methods I mentioned earlier, the supplemental data sets. They included the ABR Inc. Peb Limited Partnership Habitat Mapping plots, the Jorgensen, Tor Jorgensen's Glacial Geology plots, and Tor Jorgensen's Swan Coastal Monitoring plots for the coastal areas. We really didn't sample much coastal because we had a data set. And then let me just go to the next slide to show this, and I'll come back to the next point. But again, our map, and so here's the Pebble Limited Partnership plots, yellow, the red coastal monitoring plots, and we use both data from Katmai and Lake Clark, and then these are the glacial geology plots. And classification, so it's two levels. It's individual components, so morphology, soils, and veg, and ecological components are integrated into to classify ecotypes. And morphology, we follow classification by Creed and Rieger and Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Sciences. It's been modified for specific place Alaska by Tor Jorgensen. And soils, we use the most recent edition of the Keys of Soil Taxonomy. For veg, we use VERIC level 4 veg classes, and then we do Floristic analysis using ordination and sorted tables to further classify the vegetation into kind of review plots and make sure that they're in the correct VERIC class. For the ecotypes, we use contingency analysis to partition the plots based on similarities in environment and vegetation, and soils is included in there with the environment. So for instance, here's a metric multidimensional scaling diagram for the coastal ecotypes. Our coastal ecotypes are what's symbolized here, and the distribution of these points is based on the kind of the vegetation. And so plots that together are similar in vegetation, and so you can see there's pretty nice grouping in the coastal data. Some of these ecotypes are broader and encompass more different types of vegetation types. Others are very specific. And so for the soils, we use soil samples from selected horizons for lab analysis and confirmation of physical and chemical characteristics for classification purposes. So this is per NRCS standard methods. Clark, we counted 8 of the world's 12 soil orders, so it's pretty diverse. And that included alsols, andisols, entosols, gelisols, histosols, inceptisols, mollisols, and spotisols. And I'm not going to talk about all these. I'll talk about the 4 most common that we encountered. And in the report, there's more detail about all these 8 soil orders. So, and just a little background for those who aren't familiar with soil taxonomy. Soil order is the highest level of classification. And so we use our group, our first split out into eventually soil subgroup is the finest level. And there's more detail and descriptions of these soils in the report. So ensols were the most common, 38% of observations in the field data. These are undeveloped soils that they have little to no horizon development. And organic horizons are absent or very thin. And these soils that haven't had time to develop due to their location in a dynamic environment or due to intensive land use management. And in Lake Clark, it's largely due to the dynamic environment. So you see up here, the upper photo is a photo on a reglaciated moraine, so it's just really sand and rock. And in the lower, here's a photo of an entisol from a floodplain along Current Creek. And so are soils that are moderately developed and include soils that do not meet the requirements for other soil orders. So they're pretty diverse because you can have those that are almost enough to be a certain soil order, but they're not quite there. So you end up with something like up in this upper photo, a thick organic horizon, which is very similar to a histosol, but the organic's not thick enough. So to the inceptisols or soils, this soil down here that has some horizon development, you can see these dark bands of very organic horizons and some soil structure here, but it's developed enough to fall into soil These account for 23% of the observations in the field data. And inceptisols were most common in wet meadows and shrublands in coastal lowland environments, and in rocky, loamy to ashy soils in the Alpine environments. Soils were the third most common, 20% of the observations in the field data, but they occur globally on about 1% of the ice-free land area. So this is very unique soil type and very important in Lake Clark. Andesite soils that develop from volcanic ejecta, either volcanic ash, pumice cinders, or lava, or other volcanoclastic material like lahar deposits. Andals are characterized by an abundance of volcanic glass and a low bulk density. So, say a given volume of soil feels lighter than it appears. Soils that are well developed feature a high water holding capacity, high phosphorus and organic carbon retention, and sometimes have high aluminum content that's sometimes toxic to microorganisms, which then leads to the accumulation of organic matter because it can't break down, and also really on phosphorus. The younger andesols feature coarser textures because they have just fresh volcanic glass in there that's really coarse, extreme water holding capacity, which can lead to flash floods and those sorts of things, and then high nutrient availability because that fresh is bringing in new materials that can then provide. So they can be very productive, but they can also be, if older, they can be very restrictive in the availability of nutrients. Soils were accounted for 10% of our observations, and these are soils that form in thick accumulations of organic material that are also wet for most of the growing season. Histosols occur primarily, of course, in lowlands and lacustrine bogs and fens, like you would expect. And the classification in soil taxonomy is strongly based on the degree of decomposition and type of organic material. So up in this upper photograph, this would be a sphagnum, fibrous set of sphagnum that it's mostly from sphagnum, and that they aren't decomposed, so they're fibric. Fibric materials is the lowest amount of deposition. First lower photo, which is a sapharic material, which is highly decomposed material. You can see can't really see the fibers anymore. You don't know, what the soil was anymore because it's deep. Okay, moving on to the GIS modeling. I'm going to turn this over to Matt McAnder.
Hi, this is Matt. And so I'm just going to have a couple examples here, but they're sort of, and we're going to continue touching on some examples as we go through the later parts of the presentation. But we took inputs from a lot of different sources, some that were sort of pretty available and complete, and some that we developed ourselves. One of the key layers on which we based our inputs was sort of the detailed base map imagery available for the park, and this was a pretty recent iconic mosaic at 1 meter resolution, and so there was sort of really detailed information as a base map that was available, but at the same time, the project was not scoped out. It involved sort of detailed mapping on that imagery over the whole park. So instead, what we did was targeting, which was a combination of some heads up dicing on the imagery for some really key features like the Riverine sort of plain boundaries, the geography layer, and some of the interpretation, the extent of volcanic influence. And then another example, which was not polygon digitizing, but points, which I'll go through, was to come up with those breakpoints for the Alpine and the Subalpine physiography zones. So what we did was interpret points on the Econos imagery, and then interpret a continuous threshold value. Mainly those are driven by elevation gradients, but the elevation changes as you move into different environments. So we had sort of a continuously variable elevation threshold that was driven by hundreds or thousands of individual photo interpreted points of those cut points. And I'll go through the example of how we did that Alpine modeling. This is an example near off of Lake Clark, and so the blue points, this is here in the interior of the park. The blue points are up at that higher threshold at the edge, the lower edge of the Alpine physiography zone. The yellow points here are marking the break point of the Subalpine, or basically usually the cut point between Upland and Subalpine physiography. So these are driven by cues in the vegetation signature, and you could see a high density of individual points, and then the points were sampled on the underlying elevation model, and then a smooth threshold was applied to those cut points. And so here's what we end up with as the foundational sort of physiography layer for those high elevation types. So where the subalpine begins and where the alpine begins. So this was extended over the whole park. Then another key part about the GIS modeling was that to get to the types and the soil landscapes at the end, we had a sort of a raster overlay and combination process. And the key inputs were the physiography layers we developed, and then the soil texture, which was derived from the surficial geology map, the raster vegetation, which was the third national land cover data set map, and minimize the sort of discrepancies that can result from these raster overlays. There's a process of sort of iterative review and reconciliation of the boundary discrepancies and some raster expansion to deal with minor edge discrepancies while sort of preserving the line work of the layer that we felt was more accurate spatially. And that was, as Aaron mentioned earlier, with the integrated terrain unit mapping, there's sort of an effort that's put in to ensure that you have your boundaries shared between some of those dominant, those key input features, vegetation and geomorphology. So we kept through to a large extent in the raster modeling in this project as well, although it was at a much sort of scale.
Okay, so Aaron, going to move and just talk about the different base maps that we used. Matt mentioned that were key to the ecotype and soil mapping, but we also developed other base maps. So mean air temperature. This is from the PRISM group out of Oregon, and it's a downscaled PRISM. So Matt, you want to talk about the downscaling process?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So this was we extracted the core 800 meter air temperature data that the Park Service acquired via PRISM, and sort of calculated what the elevations that are driving that, and then applied the 800 meter data, scaled that to the third resolution of our DEM, so that we had sort of an input that realistically some of the fine scale variations that are just due to orographic and elevation effects, which are pretty well understood. And then another component of this was typical snow-free day of year that Matt. Mm-hmm. So this was a raster product derived from a series of 100 Landsat images, and it sort of then images were clear or mass clouds, and then a binary map, or presence or absence was determined for each date, and that for each pixel time series of snow presence and absence was analyzed with the regression to pick the day of year that best rated the snow-covered season from the snow-free season. So this gets at the snow persistence. We didn't get this is the full snow persistence because we didn't pull the snow onset date out, and it would be better done through other means than Landsat data, but this is no melt date based on analysis of a 25-year time series. So it's sort of a landscape of how long the snow persists in the year, and it has tremendous variability in Lake Clark, and it's written for vegetation development and for soil temperatures.
On the back really quick, I forgot to mention on this map these breaks. We developed these eco-region breaks, so eco-climatic regions is what we refer to them. So the northern interior, southern interior, and then the maritime. And it was based off of, you can see in the temperature map that the northern interior is quite a bit colder than southern interior, and then the maritime. When we start looking at vegetation as well, the maritime's quite different. So this was also core to our soil landscape mapping, was having these breaks for temperature for the soil and ecotypes. So Physiography, this is a key layer for the mapping. So as Matt mentioned, the Riverine, which is the active valley bottom, was delineated over the Iconos imagery. Glacial, so the recently deglaciated areas, we used the 1950s glacial extent layer. Glaciers and snowfields, it was a combination of current era glaciers from circa 2007 glacial extent mapping, snow and ice, and snow land cover class from the National Land Cover data set, and pixels with a snow melt date of 16 August or later from the snow regime analysis. Those the saltwater influenced areas, this came from Jorgensen 2010 for the updated coastal subsections. Volcanic, so we're finding as regular and recent volcanic eruptions as in, the last century and occurring every century or a couple times per century, and digitized over Iconos based on a review of field data and photo interpretation. It's limited to the Mount Redoubt and immediately adjacent areas. And that wasn't included because the volcanic there it hasn't erupted in at least several centuries. And the soils and vegetation around Mount Redoubt were quite different because of the regular input of ash into those soils, and which leads to unique vegetation and soil types. Older soils on Iliamna that are similar and ash rich, but they've been there for a while and have had more time to develop. So Subalpine, Matt went through that example as a combination of hand digitizing and GIS modeling, and then the Lowland areas were just the remaining areas and were assigned based on the superficial geology layer mainly. So here's the Physiography map. So this is a standalone map, but it also plays into our soil mapping. Texture, so we took the digital superficial map of superficial geology map of Lake Clark National Park Reserve, GRI program. We the NRCS soil texture descriptors and grouped those in general classes. So the general soil texture classes would be, over the NRCS, but that we wouldn't have so many classes to map that it would be really be able at the scale that we're mapping. We developed a crosswalk between the superficial geology map classes and the soil texture classes, and this is based off the field data. So it's verified by the field data, and the superficial geology layer was modified by hand delineation where required, where it didn't match the field data. And there were large areas around Lake Clark itself that were bedrock that our data indicated there were deep, rich soils there. Here's the soil texture layer, and there's a table in the report that explains the different general soil texture classes. So the soil texture model, maybe this would have better to put with the other climate model. Here it is. So the relationship between air temperature, snow cover, and soil temperature at 50 centimeters was assessed using data from Alaska snowtail sites from Alaska. Sites where all three parameters were measured for at least 336 days during an individual water year, so that's October 1st through September 30th, were included in the analysis. Linear regression predicted soil temperature based on air temperature and number of days with snow cover after December 31st. the results of the linear regression model were applied in the GIS using the air temperature and snow regime layers to produce the soil temperature map. And this is the temperature map, and some areas that I think Michael Shepard pointed out in his review that there's some areas that don't really make sense. Some of these just seem too warm, and it could be because of the snow regime model having too much influence, the snow cover. But this is discussed in the report, and it talks about these areas. But
We're primarily looking for the frozen snow by this model as well. So the important thresholds are down at the colder end.
Yeah, so some of these areas where
There is not any snow-tell sites that had that level of snow cover that were used in the input. So
and that's the thing, that the data we took from all of Alaska, because there's data on soil temperature and air temperature. So there's discussion of this, and this plays into the permafrost model that I'll talk about. The permafrost model, I'll just show the map first. Created a map of the light permafrost in areas, and we based off of our field data, and granted it's a few points, but we're found permafrost are these yellow points here. We developed a conceptual model. It's similar to some work that Torge Jorgensen did in looking at where you would most likely find permafrost. And for instance, here it's like a decision tree. So for ecoregion, we counted anything maritime, ecoregion, highly likely or absent. The southern interior were included. Then it was based on physiography. Riverine, Upland, or Glacial, we said unlikely or absent. Alpine, Subalpine, Lowland, and the Ecotype. Continuing to slopes, so steeper slopes was highly likely absent. Shallower slopes were included. And soil temperature, coarse soils were considered highly likely, and then the fine soils where permafrost would be, and then we got into the soil temperature, which is able, and by general texture class, and this is based on a review of our field points, and then also just the idea that for fine textured soils, the soil temperature could be warmer to have permafrost because the ice is going to be aggregated there stronger than in than in coarser soils, and so we had these temperature breaks. And then the result of that, and applying that in this with overlaying those layers of soil temperature, and then excluding the other areas that were highly unlikely, came up with this layer here. Next, where did we get the vegetation from? The vegetation layer was we used the National Land Cover data set. If you want to talk a little bit about the existing lake climate.
So part of the process we go through is an assessment of all candidate inputs, and with the overlay of multiple layers, sort of the geographic agreement between layers is what really key as well as the accuracy of the underlying layers. And so for the land cover, there is sort of a base layer as part of the park GIS of a Lake Clark land cover map. It was together in the mid 1990s, I think. And the flaw in this data, from our perspective, was that there was, just from the era it was from, there was some spatial sets when you compared against some of the base layers, like particularly that one where orthorectified imagery. So our base layers are a lot better now, and it turns out that there was sort of recognized issues with the spatial accuracy when the map was being created, and it was sort of repeated, rubber sheeted in order to match the features that were known at the time, but it didn't accurately capture the terrain factors. So a lot of our plains, for example, were offset by 30 or more meters, and so in a ways that sort of park-specific cover layer would have been great to use. There was sort of a fatal flaw in the geolocation errors, and so we used as an alternative the National Land Cover data set, which is based on sort of and much more considerably georeferenced Landsat imagery. This is a part of the USGS. The courses, or the classes are much more generous, but we did know that for the ultimate purpose of getting at the soil landscapes, that it was that detailed enough. So that's how we ended up using the National Land Cover Database land cover layer.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so then to get to the meat of it and where we're going, so all those layers are good. They're base layers that could be used independently. What we did was overlay them, so each pixel on top of a pixel to get combinations of these pixels. And then we aggregated the ecotypes into fewer classes for mapping, so we aggregated them into similar types. Could apply them to the map ecotype, and then we also aggregated them in based on soils, so similarity in soils, soil landscape classes. And type classes represent aggregations of similar or closely associated vegetation types with differing soil textures. So, for example, alpine meadows and dwarf shrub. And soil landscapes represent aggregations of similar or closely associated soil types with different vegetation types that are typically associated through a successional sequence. So, for instance, upland, ashy, organic shrublands, and forests. The map ecotype layer, soil landscape layer. So from here, what I want to do is kind of go over and use this ELS. Right in the very beginning of the document, there's a section that's entitled "How to Use this ELS." So that it lays out two different scenarios. And so what I'll do is I'll just go over overview. There's definitions in there, some key definitions of what is a map ecotype, what is an ecotype, what is a soil landscape, and then there's the pertinent limitations is in there, and guidelines for use. So, overview, an ELS is an integrated approach of inventorying and classifying ecological characteristics from up, while using environmental and GIS modeling to better differentiate the distribution of ecosystems from the top down. Purpose and limitations. So the purpose is to provide field verification data for the classification and description of local scale, so thousands of square meters to hundreds of hectares, while simultaneously informing the analysis and mapping of ecosystem components at the landscape scale. Hundreds of thousands of hectares, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So, as far as limitations go, the classification of ecotypes should not be considered exhaustive of possible vegetation and soil types in Lake Clark. We did our best. We created a stratified sample design based off those areas that were added to us by Paige and Amy to capture the different environments in Lake Clark. But given the short sampling period and wet strains and all that, don't consider it exhaustive. So there are other things out there, most likely. And short sampling period did not allow us to collect enough data to conduct an accuracy assessment of the maps. This is an issue, and the evidence for which the CLS is appropriate include landscape scale analyses of ecological components, landscape scale management planning, and development of stratified sampling designs at the landscape scale. And so key is the landscape scale. For this document and the process document, the applications where the mapping is inappropriate include site-specific management, planning, analysis, and study design. So as I mentioned in the beginning, that's why I kind of set the stage there, that the IU approach would be better for these site-specific issues. Guidelines for use. So there's two scenarios that I lay out in the report, and there may be more, but I think these are the two most common. So the first is, you have field data, or you're standing in the field, and you want to be able to take that and reference the mapping and use the mapping. And so in this case, land managers and our researchers are interested in classifying ecotypes and relating those ecotypes to the mapping. So say you're in the field and you're collecting data, or you're in the office reviewing vegetation or soil field data. But why don't I just run through this one real quick, and I'm just going to go to the report that I have bookmarked, and we'll go through some of these examples that I out. So the first, the field data, classification and mapping. here's the section, how to use ELS. I'll stop here first. So there's two definitions, purposes, and then deadlines for use. And so, I just lay out, here's the scenario, and then here are, and describe, what tables and figures and appendices are important. And then just go through, I just run through an example right here. So say you're in the field and you want to classify an ecotype, and so go to table 5 first. Table 5 is the ecotype key. And so Ecotype key that runs you through using environment and vegetation characteristics to get you to the different ecotypes. So when you've identified your ecotype, and let's say that it's angelic, rocky, lichen tundra. You refer to the ecotype descriptions to learn information about that. So that would be this. So there's a whole section on ecotype descriptions organized by Physiography, and you'd go to that type, and I've got here photos, and then a description of the environment, vegetation, soils. What I recommend is reading through that, and seeing does what you're standing really fit that description, and if it doesn't, then look back at the and look for similar types that are under the maybe the same lead, and then go through that again, And so once you feel comfortable about the ecotype you've classified, you can there's other references too for more information about those. So table 2. So within each of these descriptors, these ecotype names, there's a generalized texture class. So here, this explains what the soil texture. Here's the class, the texture range, description, what that means, and then the predominant soil orders. So you can tie this back to soil taxonomy and the NRCS. Let's see here. So 6 walks you through the abbreviated ecotype name. So there's, so this is explained in the definitions part, but there's the long, which includes all of the ecological components, and it gets pretty lengthy and difficult to communicate. So we've come up with abbreviated names, ties that to the long name. The forest class are classes that are associated with the ecotype, and then the VERIC level 4 class or classes that are associated with those. Table 1 goes through the floristic classes. So in each one of these descriptions, at the bottom, there is a lot of description of the vegetation itself, but it says vegetation includes these different floristic classes, and you can go to table 7, find the floristic class, and then read more about the composition of the vegetation in those. Table 18. So then when we get there's a section in each that describes the different soil subgroups, and this table now descriptions of the subgroups, and it's hierarchical in nature. So it starts with the soil order, so andisols. Let me zoom in here, for instance, and then take on through suborder, the great group, and the subgroup. So this is just getting finer detail of classification. This is the MCS soil classification. And so get to the subgroup, and you have a detailed description. You can understand what those mean, because the names, if you're familiar with economy, they can be pretty informative, but right at first they sound different language. They are a different language. And additionally, with soils, you can look at how to relate this back to the soils again. So the abbreviated ecotype, and you see that these soil subgroups were grouped. These were grouped. These ecotypes here were grouped based on similar soils into soil landscape classes. So this is a link to the Ecotypes soil landscape classes in the soil landscape map. And then these are organized by physiography, so Alpine and Glacial here, Coast here in the next table. And then 27, again, then links from the soil, so the soil landscape mapping, you have your soil landscape classes at the top here, and your soil subgroups, and you can see how those, it's kind of it's then taking the soil landscape classes and your soil subgroups were grouped together mapping, so you can look at it that way too. So if you know soil land class, you can get back to that. Okay, scenario that I lay out here is then wait a minute here. So you're in the office and you want to use the classification and mapping. And so scenario, say, land managers or researchers are in the office and are interested in the location of specific park resources, into landscape scale management plan or stratified sample design. And so, basically, standalone mapping products, which I went through all those different individual maps that we use to then relate and create the map ecotypes. Those are standalone. But if you want to map ecotype landscape maps, this is the best. And so, let's say you're referring to the map ecotype map, and you choose a map class of interest. You're interested in Alpine, Gelic, barrens, and lichen tundra. So the map ecotype map. And so Alpine, Gelic, barrens, and lichen tundra. So you can look at the map in the report. You'll have the spatial GIS files that you can pull up, and you can look at them spatially. So you can determine, the tan color up in here is you can see my cursor. This color is that class. We've identified that as a map class of interest. So what we could do. Next step would be to go to Appendix 9 and locate the map ecotype class of interest in the sorted list. So 9. You see this provides the ecotypes map ecotypes alphabetically, and then aggregated ecotype code, which is basically the code that links this back to the ecotypes from the field data and the soil landscape classes and all that. I'll go through that. Right. So just keep this 10,001 in your mind. Go to C. So the next would be to refer to Appendix 6, and then use this ecotype code to determine the ecotypes that were aggregated to create the map ecotype. So landscape classes that ecotype is associated with. So Appendix 6. Oops, Table 6. Code 10,001. So the ecotypes that are associated with this that were together for mapping, Alpine, Gelic, rocky barrens, and Alpine, Gelic, rocky lichen tundra. And you can then go to the description of the ecotypes, and you can read out these two. You can see that this is the map ecotype that you were interested in originally, Alpine, Gelic, barrens, and lichen tundra. The soil landscape class that it got grouped with, and in this case, you see, this soil landscape class, actually there's several other, there's these types were all grouped because of their similarity in soils into this soil landscape class. And like I said, as I mentioned, refer to the ecotype descriptions to read about the ecotypes and their soil description section. So, and read about, it talks about the different ecotypes that were grouped in here, soil soil subgroups that were included, and again, you could reference table 27 here, landscape mapping, so you could understand the soil landscape classes and what soils were grouped in those. And then lastly, you can refer to Appendix 7, and you can see aggregate ecotype code. I've just highlighted in yellow so you can see it clearly. You see what we map strata, is where Matt was talking about how we overlaid the different layers. And so in this case, you come up, and then those create a layer itself that has a combination of the classes in those in each of those pixels. So for instance, this is northern ecoregion, Alpine physiography. Soil is in the permafrost model, comes up as frozen, and actually loamy organic is the general soil texture. And then the national cover data set, land cover class is barren land. And so these, where these occur, these combinations of map classes occurred, we gave ecotype code 10,001, which, we saw six includes these ecotypes, and then has been, and then you can type the soil landscape map. So that's, so this was the next section. So we just, so that's all I have, and we're here for questions. I know we went a lot of information, and so
Any questions on this end?
This is Amy. It's like, or can you tell me whether you were able to map the actual soil subgroups? It looks like they were grouped within map classes, but not specifically mapped themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, the soil subgroups individually aren't mapped.
Okay.
They're aggregated, and that's a similar technique as the NRCS uses, but
Right.
we produce a pixel-based map. Yep. The idea behind that aggregation is that because they split out soils so into such fine detail, you need the whole of of that aggregation is just to lump those similar soils together, so you have fewer classes, and that you can actually map them.
Sure. Yeah.
So
Tracy Christopherson speaking here, and I'm a former employee of the NRCS. And so when you're looking at an NRCS product and you're comparing the two, you may be familiar with the term component. And so a component has a soil classification subgroup tied to it, but it's referring to that soil, and it's covered with that soil classification and what they refer to as similar soils, or soils that would behave the same from both physical properties and a chemical properties standpoint. So ABR has done the same thing by aggregating essentially similar soils that are going to function the same.
This is Michael. I really appreciate the tree you showed for how you mapped out the permafrost. Do something similar to some of your other GIS layers so that people understand your rationale.
Also, for instance, where we did do some modeling, like Matt mentioned with the Alpine, Subalpine, it's all laid out and described so that the rationale can be followed. Trying to what other layers did we?
That was probably a complex example of for a single variable. So I don't know if it's laid out in level of detail for other variables, but there is sort of a certainly detailed narrative description. We did provide a lot of the sort of the intermediate data sets that we used in development with our deliverable.
Okay, great.
were talking a little bit, while you were showing the snow-free day of year maps. And I know when we had talked to you earlier, we didn't have, MODIS data that could really give us, start of season, end of season snow dates. But we are getting to the point where we'll have those data, and Chuck has been working quite a bit on that. We'll have 11 or 12 years of data very soon. Chuck, has that stack been run?
I don't complete yet.
Yeah, it's in progress. We have continuous snow season, and then first day of snow, last day of snow. So we're interested to compare our values to the model values.
This is Chuck. I think it'd be really cool to do a sort of a relative accuracy exercise looking at the MODIS, results, which are only for 10 years or so, but to compare them to your Landsat results for all the places you've done it. I think that would be pretty cool.
Right. No, and I did hear there's, some other people, so I just want to mention that similar product is available for Denali Park and also for the range of Western Arctic caribou herds, so that includes the entire Arctic network. That Landsat snow-free date product covers all of those areas as well. And as far as it would be a really interesting comparison once that MODIS data set is finalized, and they should be pretty comparable. Nominally, we have a 25 or 20 years that data going into it, but it's just that the lion's share of the data is from the Landsat 7 era, so 99 through present. So the time, the base comparison is actually pretty similar.
Any other questions? Okay, I want to say thanks very much to ABR. I think you guys have been a great group to work with. You have produced excellent data set and report, and I think you've done a bang-up job here, and I really appreciate all the hard work you've given to this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Parker.
Thank you, Parker.
So I think we'll conclude the WebEx and stop recording Brooke, and we'll call this done.